March 15th, 1981. 2117 Porter Street, South Philadelphia. A man walks toward his front door with his keys in his hand. He has no clue that these are the very last steps he will ever take. In exactly 3 seconds, a nail bomb hidden underneath his porch will explode, ripping his body apart with hundreds of pieces of sharp metal. But to understand how Philip Testa ended up dying on his own doorstep, to understand why his murder would start one of the bloodiest mob wars in American history, and to understand why his son would meet an even more terrible end just 3 years later, we have to go back to Sicily, back to the streets of South Philadelphia, back to the very beginning. This is the complete story of the Chicken Man. It is a story about loyalty and betrayal, about violence and the price you pay for it, about fathers and their sons, about wanting more and the fear that never goes away. It is a story that stretches over many years and ends with dozens of people dead. It is a story that Bruce Springsteen would make famous in a song. It is a story that would rip apart one of America's most powerful crime families from the inside. And it starts like so many American crime stories do, with an immigrant's dream. Before we get into this unbelievable true story, I would really love to know where in the world you are watching from, and what time it is where you are right now. Just drop a comment down below, and if you are getting comfortable for this trip through Philadelphia's darkest times, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss one of these deep dive stories. Give this video a thumbs up if you are ready to hear the full, unfiltered truth about the Chicken Man. Now, let's get started. The exact details of when Philip Testa was born are, like many parts of Mafia history, hidden behind different stories and information that was purposely kept unclear. Some people say he was born on April 21st, 1924, in a small mountain town called Messina, in the province of Messina in Sicily. Other people think he was actually born right here in Philadelphia, the son of parents from Sicily who had already made the dangerous trip across the Atlantic Ocean. What everyone does agree on is that Philip Testa's early years were shaped by the Sicilian culture of omerta, which is the code of silence, and by the terrible poverty that pushed hundreds of thousands of people from southern Italy to come to America in the early 1900s. Whether he came across the ocean as a baby or was born in America, Philip Testa ended up growing up in South Philadelphia, a neighborhood that had become the main center of Italian-American life in the city. South Philly during the 1920s and 1930s was like its own separate world. It was a place where people spoke Italian just as often as they spoke English, where the Catholic Church was the main place where people gathered for both social life and spiritual guidance, where big extended families lived in row houses right next to each other and did their business on their front steps and on street corners. It was also a place where organized crime was not something unusual or rare, but just a normal part of life. It was woven into the neighborhood, just like the cobblestones were set into the streets. The Mafia had come to America, along with the huge waves of Italian immigrants, and Philadelphia had become one of its most important strongholds. For young men growing up in South Philly during the Great Depression, the choice between being poor but honest and having money from illegal activities was not always simple or clear. Many of them, probably most, chose to work regular, honest jobs, to raise families, to try to achieve the American dream the legal way. But for those with a certain kind of personality, a certain willingness to use violence, a certain pull toward the power and status that came with the life, organized crime was a way out of poverty. Philip Testa was one of those men. When he was a young man, Philip Testa got involved in his family's legal chicken business, a small company that sold chickens and other poultry products around South Philadelphia. This legal business also worked as a good cover for some of his activities that were not so legal. It was because of this connection to the poultry business that he got his well-known nickname, the Chicken Man, in the world of organized crime, where image and the respect you get from others are just as valuable as money. This nickname could have seemed kind of silly or embarrassing, but Philip Testa did not mind. He made it his own. It became his signature, a name that would stick with him for his whole life. But there was nothing funny about Philip Testa. Even when he was young, people knew him for being quick to lose his temper, for being ready to fight almost anyone over almost anything. As one FBI report would later describe him, he was not a tall man, but he was strong, with powerful shoulders and arms. His temper was famous. If someone disrespected him, if someone challenged him, if someone threatened him, Philip Testa would fight them with his fists. And later on, he would use much deadlier tools. In the Italian neighborhoods of South Philadelphia, young Philip found his path. He started out like a lot of mobsters do, as a regular gambler with no real job that he paid taxes on. According to old police records, he ran numbers games. He took bets. He learned all the different parts of crime at the street level. He learned how to collect money that was owed, how to handle risk, how to know when to just scare someone and when to actually hurt them, and how to pay a cut of his earnings up the chain of command to the bosses above him. More importantly, he made friends, and one friendship, more than any other, would end up deciding the course of his whole life. Angelo Bruno was born Angelo Annaloro in Sicily in 1910, which made him 14 years older than Philip Testa. He had come to Philadelphia as a child, and just like Testa, he had grown up on the streets of South Philly. But where Testa was quick-tempered and violent, Bruno was smart and patient. Where Testa fought with his fists, Bruno fought with his mind. Where Testa was happy just being a soldier who followed orders, Bruno had the personality of a leader. The two men became close friends, even though they were very different. Or maybe exactly because they were so different, Bruno saw in Testa a loyal enforcer, a man he could trust to do what he was told without hesitating or asking questions. Testa saw in Bruno a leader worth following, a man with the brains and the vision to move up through the ranks. Their friendship was real, built on many years of shared experiences, respect for each other, and the special kind of loyalty that connects men who live outside the normal rules of society. As both men got older, their lives of crime moved forward. Bruno's rise was steady and smart. He became a made man, then a captain, and then an important player in the criminal world of Philadelphia. Testa moved up right alongside him, always one step behind, always loyal, always ready to do whatever needed to be done. In 1956, Philip and his wife Alfia had a son. They named him Salvatore. The boy would grow up with a comfortable life, protected from the terrible poverty that his father and grandfather had known. He would go to good schools. He would not want for anything. But he would also grow up knowing, on some level, that his father was not like other fathers, that the men who came to the house late at night were not just regular business partners, that the respect and fear that people showed toward Philip Testa was not the ordinary respect you show to a normal, honest businessman. Philip Testa loved his son. Nobody ever doubted that. But in the world Philip lived in, love was not enough to keep anyone safe in the end. Philip's decision to bring his son into the life he lived would turn out to be the most terrible choice he ever made. To understand how Philip Testa rose to power, we have to understand the organization he was moving up in, the Philadelphia crime family. One of the original families that came out of the Castellammarese War in the early 1930s was in the 1950s a mid-level but still important group in American organized crime. It was not as powerful as the 5 families in New York, and it was not as rich as the Chicago outfit, but it controlled a city of 2 million people in a region that included southern New Jersey and parts of Delaware. The Philadelphia family's main businesses were the traditional ones: gambling, loan sharking, getting control of labor unions, and shaking down businesses for protection money. They controlled important unions in the construction business, like the Roofers Local 30, the Iron Workers Local 405, and several Teamsters locals. Through these unions, they had a huge amount of power over the city's building industry. They could start or stop major construction projects just by saying the word. They could force contractors who wanted peace with the unions to pay them money. The boss during the 1950s was Antonio Polina. But Polina's time as boss was full of problems. There was fighting and disagreement inside the family. Different groups formed and then split up again. Ambitious captains were all trying to get ahead. Most people thought Polina just was not smart enough or good at dealing with people to manage all the strong personalities and competing interests. Angelo Bruno, meanwhile, was waiting. He had friends in New York, especially in the Gambino family, which was run by Carlo Gambino, who was becoming the most powerful boss in the whole country. Bruno had shown that he was calm and sensible, good at business, and capable of the kind of strategic thinking that kept the money coming in and kept the peace. In 1959, the Commission, which was the group that ruled the American Mafia, made its decision. Antonio Polina was removed from power. Angelo Bruno was put in as the new boss of the Philadelphia crime family. The Bruno era had begun, and Philip Testa, Bruno's loyal friend, would rise up right along with him. The way Angelo Bruno ran things was completely new for its time. Or maybe it is more accurate to say it was the opposite of what was new. The generation of mafia bosses before him had built their power on violence and making people afraid, on big, dramatic murders, and showing off their strength in public. Bruno did the exact opposite. He believed in being low-key, in negotiating, in quietly making money instead of making a big show of force. His nicknames show this way of thinking: the gentle Don, the docile Don. These were not meant as insults. They were just descriptions of how he ran things. Bruno tried to avoid violence whenever he could. He would rather solve arguments by talking things out, by negotiating, by carefully balancing what everyone wanted. When violence was absolutely necessary, he used it carefully and precisely, without the messy chaos and bad publicity that would attract unwanted attention from the police. Bruno's way of thinking also applied to his personal life. Unlike a lot of mafia bosses who lived in huge houses and drove Cadillacs, who wore expensive suits and flashy jewelry, Bruno lived a simple life. His home was a regular row house on Snyder Avenue in South Philadelphia. It looked just like thousands of other houses in the neighborhood. He drove normal cars. He dressed conservatively. When he went out, it was to restaurants in his neighborhood, to social clubs, to the same places he had been going to for years. This simple way of living was partly a smart move. It kept the police from paying too much attention to him, but it was also just who he was. Bruno did not like showing off. He had grown up poor, and he had not forgotten it. He understood that real power was not about how you looked, but about control of unions, control of politicians, control of judges, control of the money pipelines that carried millions of dollars. Under Bruno's leadership, the Philadelphia family did very well. Gambling operations brought in a steady income. Loan sharking gave huge profits. Controlling the labor unions meant that no big construction project could move forward without the family getting a piece of it. Bruno built strong connections with the New York families, especially with Carlo Gambino, whose Gambino family was the most powerful in the country. This alliance protected Philadelphia from other groups trying to move in on their territory and gave Bruno power that went far beyond his own area. Most importantly, Bruno had one rule that he enforced without any exceptions: absolutely no drug dealing. This was not because he had a problem with it morally. Bruno was a criminal. After all, it was a practical decision. He had watched how drug dealing brought terrible attention from law enforcement down on other families. He had seen how drugs ruined organizations, creating addicts and people who would inform on each other, bringing the kind of heat that destroyed careful, long-term criminal businesses. So he simply said no. Any member of the Philadelphia family caught selling drugs would be killed. No exceptions for 21 years, from 1959 to 1980. Angelo Bruno was in charge of Philadelphia. For 21 years, the family did well. For 21 years, things were mostly peaceful. Historians and people who study crime would later call this time the Pax Bruno, the Peace of Bruno, comparing it to the Pax Romana of ancient Rome. But peace, like everything in the underworld, does not last forever, and as the 1970s went on, forces were building up that would shatter the Pax Bruno forever, all through Angelo Bruno's time as boss. Philip Testa was right there with him. In the early years, Testa was one of Bruno's top captains, running his own crew of men and reporting directly to the boss. Testa's crew was involved in the family's main businesses: gambling, loan sharking, and controlling the unions. But Testa also kept up his own legal businesses, including a construction company that found contractors to do renovation work all over South Philadelphia. This business gave him both cover and opportunity. Contractors who wanted work knew they had to deal with Philip Testa, and dealing with Philip Testa meant giving the Philadelphia family a share of the profits. In 1970, when the underboss, Ignazio Denaro, died, Bruno promoted Philip Testa to that position. For the next 10 years, Testa would be Bruno's second in command, his most trusted advisor, his closest friend inside the organization. The two men met regularly, often at Testa's secret office in the Bank Street restaurant in Old City, which was later renamed Vigigliano's. The restaurant was managed by Testa's daughter, Maria, and his son Salvatore was a part owner. It was named after Virgil the Blade Merlino, a close friend of Salvatore's, a detail that would end up being important later on. As underboss, Testa's job was to handle the day-to-day running of the family, while Bruno focused on the big picture plans and relationships with other families. Testa collected the money from the captains, settled arguments between members, gave permission for certain violent acts, and made sure the family's businesses ran smoothly. It was a position with a huge amount of power and responsibility, and Testa did the job well. But the FBI was watching. In their files, agents wrote that Philip Testa was one of the most violent members of Bruno's organization, a man known for being ready to fight almost anyone over almost anything. This description was not wrong. Even though Bruno preferred to avoid violence, Testa was still a man of action, a man whose first reaction when he was challenged was to get physical. Bruno accepted this, even valued it, because he knew that any organization, no matter how peacefully it was run, needed men who were capable of violence. Philip Testa was that man. In his personal life, Testa was unusual for a high-ranking mobster. He stayed faithful to his wife Alfia, never having the mistresses that were almost expected of men at his level. He did not drink much. He kept strong Roman Catholic traditions, going to church regularly and making sure his children were raised in the faith. And in one small way of going against mafia tradition, he had a big, thick mustache, which was usually not allowed in traditional Italian organized crime circles, where men were expected to be clean-shaven. All of these details paint a complicated picture. A violent man who was also a devoted family man, a criminal who still kept his religious faith, a traditional Sicilian who broke tradition in small ways. Philip Testa was not just a simple cartoon of a mobster. He was a man full of contradictions, shaped by the brutal world he lived in, but also by the cultural and family values he never let go of. As the 1970s went on, and Testa settled into his job as underboss, life seemed stable. The family was doing well. Bruno's leadership was not being challenged. The pressure from law enforcement was something they could handle. Philip Testa had reached a position of power and respect that must have seemed impossible to reach back when he was a pockmarked boy growing up poor in South Philly. But change was coming, and the thing that would cause that change was a stretch of New Jersey coastline that had once been America's playground. Atlantic City, New Jersey, is on a barrier island about 60 miles southeast of Philadelphia. In the early 1900s, it had been one of America's top vacation spots. It was the place that inspired the Monopoly board game, a place where middle-class families and rich tourists alike came to walk on the boardwalk, swim in the Atlantic Ocean, and enjoy the kind of nice, family-friendly fun that was typical of America before the war. But by the 1970s, Atlantic City had fallen apart and become a sad shadow of what it used to be. Air travel had made it easier to go to more exciting places. The city's buildings and roads were crumbling. Poverty and crime had taken over. The grand old hotels were falling into disrepair. Atlantic City was dying. Then came what looked like salvation. In 1976, voters in New Jersey approved a law that made casino gambling legal in Atlantic City. The idea was that casinos would bring in money to invest, create jobs, and bring in tax money, bringing the dying city back to life. And sure enough, within a few years, the big casino companies started planning huge new developments. Atlantic City was going to be turned into Las Vegas East. For the Philadelphia crime family, this was a huge opportunity. Atlantic City had always been considered Philadelphia's territory. It was right in their backyard, easy to get to, and filled with people who did business with Philadelphia. Just the construction projects alone meant hundreds of millions of dollars in possible kickbacks and control over the unions. Once the casinos opened, there would be chances to skim money from the profits, to loan money at high interest to gamblers, to get into prostitution and drug dealing. All the parasitic businesses that follow gambling wherever it goes. But Angelo Bruno made a decision that shocked and angered a lot of members of his family. He said that Atlantic City was open, meaning that other mafia families, especially the ones from New York, would be allowed to do business there without any interference from Philadelphia. Bruno had a strategic reason for this. He wanted to avoid a gang war with New York, which had way more people and money. By sharing Atlantic City, he could keep the peace and make sure that Philadelphia still got at least some of the profits. To the younger, more ambitious members of the family, this decision looked like weakness. They saw Bruno as giving in to New York, as giving away territory that should belong only to Philadelphia. Add to that Bruno's complete ban on drug dealing, at a time when selling drugs was making huge amounts of money for other families, and people started to get angry. And some of those angry members, including Philip Testa himself, started doing things on their own. Bruno's ban on drug dealing was absolute, and he made it very public. Anyone caught selling drugs would be killed. Bruno had said this many times. But the huge amounts of money that could be made from drugs were just too tempting for some members to resist. If Bruno did not know about it, if they were careful and quiet about it, maybe they could get away with it. Philip Testa was one of the people who secretly ran drug operations behind Bruno's back. So was Antonio Caponegro, who was the family's consigliere, or advisor. So were Harry Riccobene, Raymond Martorano, and some others. These men came up with different reasons to justify what they were doing. Everyone else is doing it. The money is too good to pass up. Times are changing, and Bruno is out of touch. They were only breaking one rule, not actually challenging Bruno's leadership, but they were playing a dangerous game, the Mafia, for all its violence and criminal activity. Operated on certain basic rules, loyalty was the most important thing. Obeying the boss's orders was absolute. To disobey the boss, even in secret, even in ways he might never find out about, was to weaken the very thing the whole organization was built on. It set a precedent. It planted the idea that rules could be broken if you thought you could get away with it. And once that idea took hold, the bonds of discipline that held the organization together started to come apart. Still, as long as Bruno did not find out, and as long as the profits kept moving up to him, the system stayed together. The Pax Bruno continued. The family did well. Life went on. But in the late 1970s, Antonio Caponegro started thinking bigger. Caponegro, who was known as Tony Bananas, was Bruno's consigliere, his counselor, his advisor, the person who was supposed to give him wise advice based on experience. But Caponegro had his own ambitions. He looked at Bruno, who was now almost 70 years old, careful, set in his old ways, and saw a man whose time had passed. He looked at the opportunities in Atlantic City and saw them being given away to New York. He looked at the drug money that other families were making and saw Philadelphia being left behind. Tony Bananas started to make plans, and by planning to kill Bruno, he started the chain of events that would end up killing both Angelo Bruno and Philip Testa, destroying dozens of lives and ripping the Philadelphia crime family apart from the inside. Antonio Caponegro's plan to kill Angelo Bruno was bold, but he knew he could not do it alone. The Mafia rules were clear. You could not kill a boss without getting permission from the commission, the ruling group made up of the bosses of the biggest families. To kill a boss without permission was to ask for quick and terrible payback. So Caponegro went looking for permission, or at least he thought he did. Frank Thierry was the boss of the Genovese crime family in New York, one of the most powerful positions in American organized crime. Caponegro had connections to the Genovese family through his operations in North Jersey, where the territories of New York and Philadelphia overlapped. He went to Thierry with his idea, "Let me kill Bruno. Let me take over Philadelphia, and we can work together more closely on Atlantic City and other opportunities." According to Caponegro, Thierry gave his approval. According to Caponegro, Thierry told him that the commission had talked about it and had all agreed that Bruno had to go. According to Caponegro, he had the permission he needed. But Frank Thierry had lied, or to be more accurate, Thierry had tricked Caponegro into believing something that helped Thierry's own plans. Thierry did want Bruno dead. Bruno's careful, conservative approach did limit New York's opportunities in the area. But Thierry did not want to be seen as the one who ordered the hit. So he encouraged Caponegro, let him think he had permission, and then just waited to see what would happen. Thierry's real reason was simple greed. Caponegro was in charge of very profitable gambling operations in North Jersey. If Caponegro killed Bruno without permission from the commission would order Caponegro to be killed as punishment. And once Caponegro was dead, Thierry could take over those North Jersey operations for himself. It was a brilliant, sneaky plan. Thierry would get rid of Bruno without any of the blame falling on New York. He would get Caponegro killed and take over his operations. And he would send a message to every ambitious underboss and consigliere in the country. The commission's authority was absolute, and challenging it meant death. But for his plan to work, Thierry needed Caponegro to actually kill Bruno. And on March 21st, 1980, that is exactly what happened. Friday night, March 21st, 1980, South Philadelphia. The neighborhood where Angelo Bruno had lived his whole adult life, where he was known and respected, where he had raised his family and built his empire. The evening was cool, but not cold. Spring was slowly starting after another Philadelphia winter. Bruno, 69 years old, had spent the evening out at dinner. He was being driven by John Stanfa, a member of the family who often acted as his driver. The car, a regular vehicle with no armor or special protection, drove through the familiar streets. Bruno sat in the passenger seat, relaxed, comfortable. He was going home to his modest row house at the corner of 10th Street and Snyder Avenue in the lower Monumenting section of South Philly. The car pulled up in front of Bruno's house. A quiet street with row houses on both sides. Neighbors who had known Bruno for decades, who saw him as just another guy from the neighborhood. Maybe a little better dressed, maybe a little better off. But still one of them. The car stopped. Bruno stayed in his seat, maybe saying goodnight to Stanfa, maybe talking about something they needed to do the next day. From behind the car, a figure came out of the shadows. The man moved quickly, but not like he was panicked. He was professional, calm. He was carrying a shotgun. He walked up to the passenger side of the car, where Angelo Bruno was sitting, not knowing anything was wrong. The gunman raised the weapon. Angelo Bruno, if he saw anything at all in those last split seconds, would have only seen a dark shape, a movement, the beginning of a realization that came too late. The shotgun went off. The blast hit Bruno in the back of the head from very close range. The damage was catastrophic, instant, absolute. Angelo Bruno, the boss of the Philadelphia crime family for 21 years, the gentle Don who had kept the peace and brought wealth, died immediately. John Stanfa, sitting in the driver's seat, was hurt but lived. Whether he was just lucky to survive, or whether the gunman meant to leave him alive because someone needed to see what happened and be able to tell others, nobody knows for sure. The gunshots echoed through the quiet neighborhood. Doors opened, neighbors came outside, someone screamed. Someone called the police. Within minutes, sirens were wailing through South Philadelphia. Police cars rushed to 10th and Snyder. Ambulances arrived. Detectives started their work. But long before the official investigation could really get going, another investigation had already started. An investigation by the one organization that really mattered in this situation. The commission wanted to know who had killed Angelo Bruno and why. The murder of Angelo Bruno sent shockwaves through the American Mafia. For 21 years, Bruno had been a calming, steady force, a voice of reason and moderation in a world that was getting more and more torn apart by violence and arguments over drug dealing. His relationships with other bosses, especially Carlo Gambino of New York, who had died in 1976, had been the glue holding together complicated agreements between different families. His death left a huge empty space where power should be in Philadelphia and raised urgent questions about who had given permission for the killing. and what it meant for the careful balance of power among all the families. In South Philadelphia, people were scared. Made men and associates knew that Bruno's murder had broken the most important rule of how the Mafia was supposed to work. If the hit had been approved by the commission, it meant they had lost faith in Bruno and had said it was okay to get rid of him. If it had not been approved, it meant that someone had done something that could never be forgiven and would be killed to get even for it. Either way, blood was going to be spilled. Philip Testa, as Bruno's underboss and closest friend, was devastated. He had lost not just his boss, but a man he had known for decades. A friend who had lifted him up, trusted him, and relied on him. The sadness was personal and deep, but Testa could not afford to just give in to his grief. He had responsibilities. The family needed someone to lead it. The organization had to keep running. Business had to go on. But who would lead? In theory, the underboss would normally move up to become boss when the old one died or went to prison. But that tradition assumed a normal passing of power, not a murder. The commission would have to decide. And until they did, nobody knew what was going to happen. Meanwhile, Antonio Caponegro was thrilled. He thought he had pulled it off. He had killed Bruno with what he thought was the commission's blessing. Now he would be confirmed as the new boss of Philadelphia. He would open up Atlantic City to his own crews. He would allow drug dealing and take in the huge profits. He had won. In early April 1980, Caponegro went to New York. He was expecting to be crowned the winner. He expected the bosses of the commission to congratulate him, to officially recognize him in his new position, to welcome him as one of their equals. Instead, he walked right into his own execution. The meeting in New York did not go the way Antonio Caponegro expected. Instead of congratulations, he was faced with the commission, the bosses representing the Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, Colombo, and Bonanno families of New York, plus representatives from other cities, made their position very clear. They had never given permission for Bruno's murder. Caponegro had broken the most sacred rule of the organization. He had killed the boss without permission, and for that, there was only one punishment. Caponegro tried to defend himself. He said Frank Thierry had given him permission. He said he had been told the commission had approved. But Thierry, of course, denied everything. And even if Thierry had encouraged Caponegro, it did not matter. The commission's rules were clear. You needed direct, unmistakable permission. Anything less than that was not allowed. Caponegro had taken a gamble, and he had lost. On April 17, 1980, less than a month after Angelo Bruno was murdered, Antonio Caponegro's body was found in the trunk of a car in the South Bronx. He was naked. He had been beaten terribly. He had been tortured. There were cigarette burns all over his body. His fingers looked like they had been broken. His face was almost impossible to recognize from all the blows. And as a final, symbolic gesture, torn-up $20 bills were scattered over his corpse. The message was clear. Caponegro had been killed because of his greed, for putting money ahead of loyalty and respect for the rules. A mile away in Harding Park, the police found another body, Alfred Salerno, Caponegro's brother-in-law, who had been involved in the Bruno hit. He had been treated the same way, tortured, executed, thrown away like garbage. The bodies were not identified for almost 2 weeks. When they finally were, the message had already spread through the underworld. The commission had spoken. The old rules still applied. No one was above them. And anyone who thought they could kill a boss without permission would meet the same end. But Caponegro and Salerno were not the only people who had been part of the plot. The commission wanted everyone who had been involved in Bruno's murder dead. Frank Sinden, who had helped plan the hit, was found murdered in 1980. John Simone, another person in the plot, was killed in 1981. The commission's revenge was complete and without mercy. And then the commission turned its attention to the question of who would lead the Philadelphia family. They needed someone they could trust, someone who had been loyal to Bruno, someone who understood the old ways and would not make the same mistakes Caponegro had made. They chose Philip Testa. In the spring of 1980, the commission officially made Philip Testa the new boss of the Philadelphia crime family. In many ways, it was a logical choice. Testa had been Bruno's underboss for 10 years. He had been loyal. The other members respected him. He had strong connections with the New York families. He knew everything about how the family operated. But Testa also took over a family that was in crisis. Bruno's murder had shattered the Pax Bruno. The younger members, who had been annoyed by Bruno's old-fashioned, careful rules, saw this as a chance for things to change. The drug dealers who had been working in secret under Bruno wondered if Testa would keep the ban or if he would let them sell drugs openly. Ambitious captains looked at the empty space at the top and thought about their own chances of moving up. And hanging over everything was the example of what had happened to Caponegro. It was a warning, but it was also proof that if you could successfully kill a boss, there was a huge amount of power waiting for you. Testa's first decisions about who to put in the top positions were extremely important. For his underboss, he chose Peter Casella, a captain who controlled crews in South Jersey and other parts of North Jersey. Casella was a drug dealer, one of the people who had secretly broken Bruno's rule against it. But Testa either did not know this or he chose to ignore it. This would turn out to be a terrible mistake. For his consigliere, Testa made an even more controversial choice: Nicodemo Little Nicky Scarfo. Nicodemo Scarfo was everything Angelo Bruno was not. Where Bruno was calm, Scarfo was quick to explode. Where Bruno tried to avoid violence, Scarfo welcomed it. Where Bruno was good at talking to people, Scarfo was confrontational. Where Bruno was respected, Scarfo was feared. Born in Brooklyn in 1929, Scarfo had moved to South Philadelphia as a child. He was short, barely 5 feet 5 inches tall, and he was very sensitive about his height. Anyone who made jokes about how small he was, anyone who showed him any disrespect, anyone who crossed him in any way could expect a violent reaction. Scarfo's temper was famous. He had killed his first man over an argument about a booth in a restaurant, a stupid, pointless argument that ended with Scarfo stabbing the other man to death. Only his connections to the Bruno family kept him from getting a life sentence. He was found guilty of manslaughter instead of murder and served a relatively short time in prison. But even after he got out, Scarfo was still a problem. His violence was too public, too out of control. In the early 1960s, Angelo Bruno had made a decision. He sent Scarfo away to Atlantic City. At that time, Atlantic City was a dying resort town with very few chances for crime. Sending him there was basically a punishment, a way to get Scarfo out of Philadelphia, where his violence was attracting the attention of the police. For almost 20 years, Scarfo had been stuck in Atlantic City, running small-time operations, holding on to his anger and resentment. But then, the casinos came to Atlantic City suddenly. Scarfo found himself right in the middle of the most valuable territory in the whole region. He started to do well. He made connections. He made money. And when Philip Testa became boss and needed a consigliere, Scarfo saw his chance to come back to power. Testa's decision to make Scarfo his consigliere was controversial inside the family. A lot of members were afraid of Scarfo's violence and how unstable he was. But loyalty was the most important thing to Testa. And Scarfo had been loyal to Bruno and to the family, even though he had been sent away. Maybe Testa thought that Scarfo's scary reputation would help him keep control in a family that was starting to show cracks. It was a decision that Philip Testa would not live long enough to regret. But his son, Salvatore, would pay the price for it for years to come. One of Philip Testa's first acts as boss was to hold a big induction ceremony. On June 8, 1980, just a few months after Bruno was killed, a group of associates gathered at the South Philadelphia home of John Caponegro, a respected captain in the family. The ceremony would follow the traditional Mafia rituals: pricking the finger, earning the saint's card, the oath of omerta, and loyalty. The living room of John Caponegro's modest South Philly row house was cleared of furniture. A long table was covered with a white cloth. A gun and a knife lay crossed in the center. Next to a picture of the Madonna, each new member came in alone, kissed the cheeks of the leaders who were sitting down, Testa at the head of the table, Scarfo to his right, and then stood as his trigger finger was pricked with a pin. A drop of blood marked the saint card, usually one of Our Lady of Mount Carmel, which was then lit on fire in his palm while he said the words, "As this card burns, so may my soul burn if I betray my friends." The smoke curled up toward the ceiling as the new-made men swore to be completely loyal to the family, above God, above their country, and above their own blood relatives. Among the men being brought into the family that night were some of the most important figures in the family's future. Salvatore Testa, Philip's own son, just 24 years old, tall, handsome, with a lot of charm. Salvatore had grown up in this life and had shown he was capable. His father must have felt incredibly proud in that moment. Philip Crazy Phil, Linetti, Scarfo's nephew, even with the nickname. Linetti was smart and capable, and he was going to become Scarfo's underboss one day. Salvatore Chucky Merlino, who would later become underboss under Scarfo. Lawrence Yogi Merlino, Chucky's brother. Frank Little Frankie Narducci Jr., the son of Frank Narducci SR, one of Testa's captains, and several others who would have important roles in the violent years to come. Full of betrayal, the ceremony itself followed old traditions that had been around for a long time. Each man was brought into a room where the family's leaders were sitting and waiting. Each man's finger was pricked with a pin. The blood was drawn to represent the blood connection they were making. A card with a picture of a saint was put in the man's hand and set on fire. And as it burned, each man said the oath: to put the family above everything else, to never tell its secrets, to live by omerta, and to die by it if he had to. Nicodemo Scarfo and his wife, Dolores, stood as godparents for Salvatore Testa. It was a position of honor that meant there was a special connection between them, a particular bond of loyalty and protection. Scarfo, short and tense, already known for his temper, stood proudly next to his elegant wife as Salvatore was brought in. In Mafia tradition, godparents became compari, spiritual parents who were responsible for guiding the new soldier. Scarfo put his hand on young Sal's shoulder and promised to protect him as long as I breathe. Less than 4 years later, Scarfo would order Salvatore Testa to be killed, proof that in the new Philadelphia, even the bonds between godparent and godson disappeared when power demanded it. In Mafia culture, godparents to a made man had responsibilities not unlike those of religious godparents: to guide, to protect, to make sure the young man developed the right way inside the organization. It should have been a night of celebration, of things continuing as they had. of the old generation passing things on to the new. But looking back, that ceremony was a gathering of men who would end up destroying each other. Within 4 years, several of the men who were brought into the family that night would be dead, murdered by their own brothers, betrayed by the people they trusted most. The oath of omerta and loyalty would turn out to be meaningless. The bonds of blood would dissolve into paranoia and ambition. But on that June night in 1980, as Philip Testa watched his son become a made man, as Scarfo stood as his godfather, as the young men said their oaths, no one could see the horror that was coming. Philip Testa's time as boss was marked by more and more instability. Unlike Angelo Bruno, who had led through talking and patience, Testa led using his traditional understanding of power, loyalty that was enforced by the threat of violence. But the world had changed. The new generation of mobsters did not respect tradition as much. They were more motivated by making money right away, more willing to betray others for their own personal gain. The Second Philadelphia Mob War, which historians would later say lasted from 1980 to 1984, had already started. There were many different groups forming inside the family. There were those loyal to Testa, who wanted to bring back stability. There were those loyal to Scarfo, who saw his aggressive style as the future of the organization. There was Harry Rickabean's group, which did not like either Testa or Scarfo and wanted to operate on its own. And there were various captains who were mostly loyal only to themselves and were thinking about their own chances to get power. Drug dealing continued to be a major source of conflict. Testa, like Bruno before him, officially said no to drug operations. But it was getting harder and harder to enforce this rule. The profits were just too huge. The younger members saw that mobsters in other families were getting rich from drugs, and they did not like being held back by rules they thought were old-fashioned. Meanwhile, the situation in Atlantic City was still causing problems. The first casinos had opened, Resorts International in 1978, then Caesars, Bally's, and others, one after another. Billions of dollars were pouring into construction and running the casinos. The Philadelphia family was getting its share, but a lot of members felt they should be getting more. The fact that New York families were doing business openly in what they thought was Philadelphia's territory made them angry. Gambino and Genevieve's crews pushed their way into the bartenders. Unions and construction contracts at places like Caesars and the Sands, which was about to open. Philadelphia soldiers watched millions of dollars flow north while they picked up whatever was left. Testa demanded meetings with the New York bosses to try to take back control. Scarfo argued in private that they should go to war if talking did not work. The tension became a slow-burning fuse, and there was another problem: the federal police. The FBI had been looking into the Philadelphia family for years. But in the late 1970s and early 1980s, they got a powerful new tool: the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, or RICO. It was passed in 1970, but it was not used in a big way until the 1980s. RICO allowed prosecutors to charge whole criminal organizations and to give harsh punishments to members for the actions of the organization as a whole. The FBI was putting together cases that would end up destroying the Philadelphia family. Philip Testa was trying to hold everything together, managing the groups inside the family that were fighting, dealing with New York, figuring out the Atlantic City situation, and staying ahead of the police. But he was also dealing with a more immediate threat, one he did not fully understand until it was too late. His own underboss wanted him dead. In early 1981, federal prosecutors in Philadelphia brought a major racketeering case against the leaders of the Philadelphia crime family. The investigation called Operation Gangplank, was one of the first big uses of RICO against an East Coast family. It was a new way of doing things for the police. Instead of trying to prove individual crimes one by one, they used the RICO law to go after criminal businesses as ongoing conspiracies. The charges, which were announced in February 1981, named Philip Testa and several other high-ranking members, Frank Narducci SR, a captain and the father of one of the men Testa had just brought into the family, Harold and Mario Riccabene, brothers who ran their own group inside the family, Pasquale Spirito, another captain, Joseph Chicchi Ciancaglini, a member for a long time, and many other associates and soldiers. The charges included racketeering, gambling, loan sharking, and extortion, the regular, everyday business of organized crime. But what made Operation Gangplank so important was how big it was and how it was done legally. The prosecutors were going after the organization itself. They were using testimony and recordings from wiretaps to prove that the Philadelphia crime family was a criminal business and that its members were involved in an ongoing pattern of racketeering. Testa reacted the way a lot of mafia bosses did when they were faced with grand jury investigations. He refused to help them when he was called to testify in front of the grand jury. He said he would not answer questions because it might incriminate him. When they pushed him harder, he still refused to answer any questions at all. The judge decided he was in contempt of court and sent him to prison. The time in prison was supposed to be short, just long enough to force him to talk, or until the grand jury finished its work. But for Philip Testa, being locked up was a distraction at the worst possible time. While he was in prison, unable to manage the family's daily operations, unable to see the threats that were building up around him, his enemies were making their move. Peter Casella, his underboss, had decided that Philip Testa had to die. Peter Casella's reasons for wanting Testa dead were complicated. Partly, it was because he wanted power for himself. He wanted to be boss. Partly, it was about money. Casella was heavily involved in drug dealing, and he thought that with Testa gone, he could operate more openly and make more money. Partly, it was personal. There might have been insults or arguments between the two men that grew into a murderous hatred. But whatever his reasons, Casella knew he could not kill Testa alone. He needed all eyes. He found one in Frank Narducci SR, a captain who was also facing federal charges in Operation Gangplank. Narducci was close to Testa. He was close enough that Testa had helped get Narducci's son accepted into the family just a few months earlier. But being close in the mafia world did not protect anyone from ambition and fear. Narducci wanted power, and he was facing serious time in prison. Maybe he thought that the chaos after Testa's death would mess up the federal cases against him. Maybe he just saw a chance to take advantage of the situation. Casella and Narducci brought in other people, Rocco Marinucci, a young associate who knew about explosives and construction, Theodore de Pasquale, who would help with the technical parts of building the bomb. The group of people planning the murder was small and tight, made up of men who trusted each other and who thought they could kill Testa and take power before anyone could react. Their plan was clever. They would use a nail bomb, a device packed with nails that would act as deadly shrapnel when it exploded. The bomb would be hidden under Testa's front porch when Testa came home. Marinucci would be waiting in a van across the street, watching through the windshield. When Testa got to his front door, Marinucci would press a button on a remote detonator, and the bomb would go off. The men making the plan thought that the explosion might be mistaken for a gas leak. Row houses in South Philadelphia often had old gas lines, and accidental explosions, while not common, did happen sometimes. Even if the police figured out it was a bomb, most of the evidence would be destroyed in the blast. And by the time anyone figured out what had really happened and who was responsible, Casella would have taken control and established himself as the new boss. There was just one problem with this plan. They had not asked for or received permission from the commission. Just like Antonio Caponegro had killed Bruno without the right permission, Casella and the others who were plotting with him were making the same deadly mistake. They were so focused on the details of the murder and what would happen right afterward that they did not think about what would happen later. The commission had killed Caponegro for killing a boss without permission. Why did Casella think it would be any different for him? Maybe he thought that if he acted fast and decisively, he could just present the commission with a situation that was already finished. Maybe he thought that with Testa dead, the chaos in Philadelphia would make it impossible for the commission to do anything about it effectively. Maybe he was just blinded by his ambition and did not think clearly about what would happen next. Whatever he thought, he was wrong, and his mistake would cost him everything. But first, it would cost Philip Testa his life. March 1981. Winter was turning into spring. Philip Testa had been released from prison after his short time in jail for contempt. He was back at work, trying to manage the family's operations, dealing with the federal charges, and trying to navigate the complicated politics of the underworld. He was 56 years old, in his 14th month as boss, still trying to stabilize an organization that had been thrown into chaos by Angelo Bruno's murder. Testa had no way of knowing that his underboss was planning to kill him. In the Mafia world, the underboss is supposed to be the boss's most trusted assistant, his right-hand man, the person who will take over for him and continue what he started. The idea that Peter Casella would betray him might not have even crossed Testa's mind. Yes, there was tension in the family. Yes, there were groups fighting and arguments. But that was normal. It was manageable. It was just how the organization worked. What Testa did not understand, what he maybe could not understand, given his traditional values and his faith in the old ways, was that the basic bonds that held the organization together were coming apart. The code of Omerta, the respect for who was in charge, the loyalty to the boss, these were becoming empty rituals. Things people said in public, but ignored in private. The new generation, raised in an America very different from the immigrant poverty that had shaped Testa and Bruno's generations, had different values. Money mattered more than respect. Getting ahead as an individual mattered more than loyalty to the organization. The old traditions and rules felt like obstacles to be gotten around, not like guardrails that kept everyone safe from chaos. Philip Testa kept doing what he always did. He met with captains. He collected their payments. He settled arguments. He went to his office at Vigiliano's restaurant, where his daughter worked and his son had a share of the business. He came home to his house at 2117 Porter Street, the house he had lived in for years, in the neighborhood he had known his whole life. Surrounded by people he had grown up with, he was a creature of habit, and the men plotting against him were counting on that. Sunday, March 15th, 1981. The day started normally enough. Testa got up, did his morning routine. Maybe he went to church. It was Sunday, after all. And even though he was a criminal, he still kept his Catholic traditions. The weather was cool, normal for the middle of March in Philadelphia. Not quite spring yet, but winter was letting go. We do not know exactly how Testa spent that Sunday. He might have had meetings with associates. He might have spent time with his family. He might have just relaxed, read the newspaper, watched television. From everything people have said, it was an ordinary day. The kind of quiet Sunday that would have been completely forgotten if it had not ended the way it did. Across the street from Testa's home, Rocco Marinucci sat in a van. The vehicle was parked where it had a clear view of 2117 Porter Street. Inside, Marinucci had the remote detonator for the bomb that had been carefully hidden under Testa's front porch days. Or maybe weeks earlier, the bomb was a complicated device. Nails packed around an explosive core designed to create a deadly cloud of metal shrapnel. When it went off, the nails would act like bullets, shooting out in every direction, tearing apart anything in their way. Marinucci waited. He had been waiting for hours. Maybe watching the house, watching the neighborhood, waiting for Testa. In the van, he would have been invisible. Just another vehicle on a residential street. Nothing to attract attention or make anyone worried. The neighbors who walked by, the children playing in Stephen Gerrard Park across the street, the families going about their Sunday routines. None of them knew that they were just feet away from a man getting ready to commit murder. As evening came, Testa came home. His car pulled up to the curb in front of 2117 Porter Street. He got out of the car. He was alone. He walked toward his front door, keys in his hand behind him. The street was quiet all around him. The neighborhood was peaceful. Families finishing dinner, getting ready for the work week ahead, settling in for the evening. Testa reached his front door. His hand reached out toward the doorknob. The keys jingled. In the van, Rocco Marinucci watched. His finger was on the detonator button. He only had one chance to get this right. If he set it off too early, Testa might survive. If he waited too long, Testa would be inside the house, and the blast might not kill him. The timing had to be perfect. Testa's hand touched the doorknob. Marinucci pressed the button. The bomb went off with terrible force. In an instant, the carefully packed explosives turned into expanding gases and a shock wave. The nails packed around the explosive core shot outward at incredible speed. Supersonic projectiles fired in every direction all at once. Philip Testa's body, standing right above the bomb, was hit by hundreds of these projectiles. The nails tore through his clothes, his skin, his muscles, his bones. The shockwave lifted his body and threw it backward. The front porch shattered, wood splintering, bricks breaking apart, the whole structure collapsing into pieces. The front windows of the house exploded inward. Glass broke into thousands of deadly shards. The house next door, just a few feet away, was badly damaged. Windows blown out, walls cracked. The family inside thrown to the floor by the blast. The sound was huge. A crack of thunder that echoed across South Philadelphia. In homes all over the neighborhood, people jumped at the noise. Pictures fell off walls. Dishes rattled in cabinets. Car alarms went off. Dogs barked frantically. Then, for just a moment, there was silence. That strange quiet that follows an explosion. As if the world itself is stunned, then the screaming started. Neighbors ran out of their houses. The scene they saw was impossible to understand. The front of 2117 Porter Street was destroyed. Rubble covered the sidewalk and the street. Chunks of brick, splintered wood, twisted metal, smoke hung in the air. The sharp smell of explosives burned their noses and throats. And in the middle of all the rubble lay Philip Testa. His body was almost impossible to recognize. The nails had done their work with terrible efficiency. Massive damage to his head, his chest, his arms, his legs. Blood pooled around him, spreading across the concrete. Some of the people who rushed to help stopped when they saw him, horrified, unable to process what they were seeing. Others tried to help, calling his name, pressing their hands against his wounds in useless attempts to stop bleeding that could not be stopped. Someone called 911 within minutes. Sirens wailed through the streets. An ambulance arrived. Emergency medical technicians worked frantically, knowing even as they did that it was hopeless. They loaded what was left of Philip Testa onto a stretcher and rushed him to St. Agnes Hospital, about a mile away. At 1900 South Broad Street, doctors were waiting. They had been told that a bomb victim was coming. When the stretcher arrived and they saw how bad the injuries were, they knew, but they tried anyway, because that is what doctors do. They worked with desperate efficiency, trying to stabilize him, trying to save a life that was already gone. At 4:15 p.m., Philip the Chicken Man Testa was pronounced dead, the official cause of death, as written down by Assistant Medical Examiner Halbert Fillinger, was multiple injuries, a clinical phrase that could not even begin to describe the violence that had been done to his body. Even as the doctors were working on Philip Testa at St. Agnes Hospital, the police were securing the scene at 2117 Porter Street. Uniformed officers blocked off the area with yellow crime scene tape. Detectives arrived, then forensic specialists, then FBI agents. By evening, Porter Street was crowded with police vehicles, their lights painting the brick row houses in flashing red and blue. The investigation started immediately. Bomb fragments were collected from all the rubble. Nail fragments were pulled out of the walls of the houses next door. The remains of Testa's porch were carefully examined. Witnesses were questioned. Neighbors who had seen or heard anything, family members, associates who might know if Testa had received any threats. The conclusion came quickly. This was definitely a bomb, not an accidental gas explosion. The nails made that absolutely clear. The pieces of the remote detonation mechanism told the investigators that this was a sophisticated murder, carefully planned and professionally carried out. Someone had wanted Philip Testa dead badly enough to plant a bomb at his home and wait for the perfect moment to set it off. But who and why? The FBI already had an idea who, at least in terms of what kind of group did it. This was clearly a murder done by someone inside the Mafia. No one else would have the reason or the ability to get to him. No one else would use this method. This was Philadelphia mobsters killing their own boss, just like they had killed Angelo Bruno a year earlier. The question of why was more complicated. Testa had been boss for barely a year. He had been Bruno's loyal underboss for 10 years before that. What had he done to deserve this? Who would gain from his death? Who would be bold and stupid enough to kill another boss without permission from the commission, after what had happened to Tony Bananas? As the investigators worked through the night, as forensic experts sifted through the rubble, as detectives questioned witnesses, the underworld was already reacting. Word of Testa's murder spread through South Philadelphia like wildfire. Made men and associates heard the news and immediately started thinking about what it meant for them. Alliances shifted. Plans were made. Some men went into hiding, afraid they might be next. Others reached out to their allies, getting ready for the war that was surely coming. In New York, the commission was furious. Within hours, Genevieve's boss Vincent the Chin, Gigante, and Gambino representatives were demanding answers. They knew another unauthorized boss killing meant chaos and the potential for federal heat on their own doorsteps. Casella, thinking that moving fast would make his takeover seem okay, drove to New York the next day to claim leadership. The commission listened to him, then quietly agreed that he should be eliminated. Less than 2 months later, Casella would be found shot dead in his car. Payment for repeating Caponigo's mistake. Another boss killed without permission. another breaking of the most basic rules. Heads would roll for this, blood would flow, but first, they needed to find out who was responsible. They did not have to wait long. Peter Casella would tell them himself. In the time right after Philip Testa was killed, chaos took over the Philadelphia crime family. With the boss dead and the organization's structure falling apart, many different groups were trying to take control. Peter Casella, as underboss, had the strongest claim to be the leader. In normal times, he would just step into the boss's role and the commission would confirm him. But these were not normal times. Casella had murdered his own boss. The second boss killing in 13 months. The commission was not just going to hand him power. Nicodemo Scarfo, as consigliere, also had a claim. He was the number 3 man in the organization. He was based in Atlantic City, where huge amounts of money were flowing. He had Testa's trust at the end, having been put in his position by the murdered boss. And he had something else. He had not been part of the murder plot. For once, his hands were clean. The commission moved quickly. They called both Casella and Scarfo to New York for a meeting. What happened in that meeting would decide the future of the Philadelphia family. The meeting took place in a social club in Manhattan, the kind of anonymous storefront that served as neutral ground for mafia business. Representatives from the major New York families were there. The Gambinos, the Genovese, the Luccheses. These were men who had seen everything, who had lived through decades of gang wars and power struggles, who understood the delicate balance of power that kept the American Mafia working. Peter Casella arrived thinking he could lie his way through it. He would say he did not know anything about the murder plot. He would promise stability and cooperation. He would swear loyalty to the commission. He would do whatever it took to get their approval. But the commission already knew the truth. They had informants, they had wiretaps, they had sources all through the underworld, and more importantly, they had experience reading men who lied to them. Under questioning, Casella broke down. Whether it was because of direct threats, because of all the evidence against him, or just because of the psychological pressure of sitting in front of the commission, knowing he had broken their most sacred rule, Casella admitted what he had done. He said that he and Frank Narducci S.R. had plotted together to kill Philip Testa. He might have tried to justify it. Testa was not effective. The family needed new leadership. It was for the good of the organization, but none of that mattered. He had killed a boss without permission, and there was only one punishment for that. Except that is not what happened, to the surprise of many. The commission did not order Casella to be killed immediately. Instead, they banished him from Philadelphia. He was stripped of his position, kicked out of the family, forbidden to ever set foot in the city again, or have any involvement in the organization's business. He was basically exiled, thrown out, but allowed to live. Why? The reasons are not clear, lost to history and the incomplete record of mafia meetings. Maybe the commission thought that another high-profile murder would bring too much attention from the police. Maybe they thought that exile was punishment enough, that taking away Casella's power and status and sending him away to live in disgrace was a fate worse than death. Maybe there were political reasons, favors owed, relationships to protect, complicated calculations of diplomacy between families that required mercy instead of murder. Whatever their reason, Peter Casella ran away to Florida. He lived there with his daughter, cut off from the world he had known, stripped of the power he had killed to get. He died of natural causes in 1992. An old man who had outlived most of the people he used to know, but who had lost everything that mattered to him. Frank Narducci S.R. would not be so lucky, with Casella banished. The commission confirmed Nicodemo Scarfo as the new boss of the Philadelphia crime family. It was a controversial choice, even inside the commission itself. Scarfo's reputation for violence and instability was well known, but he had a few things going for him. He had been loyal to Bruno and Testa. He had not been involved in either murder plot, and he controlled Atlantic City at a time when that area was generating huge amounts of money. Scarfo moved quickly to make his power stronger. Within weeks, he called the captains to a meeting at the Garden State Park racetrack and made them swear new oaths of loyalty. He demoted the captains who had been loyal to Casella, promoted the earners from Atlantic City, and put listening devices in social clubs to watch for anyone who disagreed with him. He made Salvatore, Chucky Merlino, his underboss, a reward for Merlino's loyalty and a smart move to get the support of Merlino's crew. For consigliere, he chose Frank Monti, a respected older member who could give him wisdom and advice. But the most important of Scarfo's early decisions had to do with Philip Testa's son. Salvatore, the young man just 25 years old, had lost his father to a bomb blast. He was filled with grief and rage, and Scarfo, in a move that was both smart and deeply dishonest, aimed that rage at a specific target: revenge. Scarfo gave Salvatore Testa permission to kill everyone who had been involved in his father's murder. It was a calculated decision. By letting Salvatore carry out his revenge, Scarfo made sure that the plotters would be punished, sent a message to anyone else who might think about betraying him, and tied Salvatore to himself through a shared purpose and through blood. Salvatore would become Scarfo's weapon, his enforcer, his rising star, and in his grief and anger, Salvatore eagerly took on that role. The first target was obvious: Frank Narducci SR, who had betrayed Philip Testa, even though they had been friends for years, and whose son had been brought into the family at the same time as Salvatore just 18 months earlier. Frank Narducci SR knew he was a dead man after Casella was banished. After the commission made its decision, after Scarfo took control, Narducci understood being part of Testa's murder meant he would be killed. He went into hiding, moving from place to place, avoiding the places he usually went, trying to stay invisible. But in the small, closed world of South Philadelphia's underworld, there was nowhere to hide. The family knew everyone, had eyes everywhere, could track a man's movements through a network of informants and associates who valued their own lives more than they valued anyone else's loyalty. On January 7th, 1982, less than 10 months after Philip Testa was killed, Frank Narducci SR was found in front of his South Philadelphia home. Narducci was tricked into coming out of hiding with promises of a meeting. As he stepped onto the sidewalk at 13th and Wolf Streets, 3 gunmen came out of a parked car. More than 20 shots, most of them .38 caliber, hit him in the head and body. Neighbors heard someone yell, "This is for Phil," before the tires screeched as the car drove away. Maybe he had been tricked into coming there with false promises of safety. Maybe he had just gotten careless, thinking enough time had passed. Maybe he had decided that living in hiding all the time was no way to live, and had chosen to face what was coming, whatever brought him there. The result was the same. Multiple gunmen opened fire. Narducci fell, his body full of bullets. And witnesses later said that Salvatore Testa was there, that he had taken part in the killing, that he had made sure Narducci saw who was shooting him before he died. Later, when talking about the people who killed his father, Salvatore would say, "I wish that expletive was alive so I could kill him again." The anger that came out in those words was real and endless. Salvatore had loved his father, and his father's death had changed him from a young man with potential into something darker. A killer who enjoyed killing, who found in violence a way to let out a grief that had no other way to be expressed. But Narducci was not the only one involved in the plot. Rocco Marinucci, the man who had built the bomb and pressed the detonator button, was still alive, and Salvatore wanted him too. March 15, 1982, exactly 1 year after Philip Testa was murdered. The symbolism was intentional and impossible to miss. Salvatore Testa wanted to send a message. No one who had killed his father would get away. No matter how long it took, no matter where they hid, they would pay. Rocco Marinucci was 30 years old, a generation younger than most made men. With his whole criminal career ahead of him, he owned Pop's Pizza in South Philadelphia, a legal business that gave him cover and income. After Testa's death, he had tried to keep a low profile, running his business, staying out of trouble, hoping that maybe he would be overlooked or forgotten. But Scarfo and Salvatore had not forgotten, and when they decided the time was right, when they decided that the anniversary of Philip Testa's death was the perfect time for poetic justice, they made their move. Marinucci was found shot to death. The details of the killing were not widely reported, but the message was clear. The plot that had killed Philip Testa had been completely taken apart. Every major person involved was dead or banished. The debt had been paid. Salvatore Testa's revenge was complete. But instead of bringing him peace, instead of letting him move on from his father's death, the killings had only pulled him deeper into the life that would eventually destroy him. He had shown he was capable, ruthless, effective, and Scarfo, watching the young man's bloody work, saw in Salvatore the perfect soldier. Loyal, violent, asking no questions, Scarfo promoted Salvatore to captain. Giving him his own crew later, he would make him acting underboss, Salvatore Testa. The son who had watched his father die violently was now in a position where he might one day lead the family himself. He had money. His father had left him an $800,000 estate. And he had legal business interests. He had respect. People all through the underworld were afraid of him because he was willing to kill. He had power. He commanded men, controlled territory, had the boss's favor. He had everything except the one thing that might have saved him: the wisdom to see that Nicodemo Scarfo was not his friend, not his protector, not the father figure he seemed to be. Scarfo was a paranoid, unstable killer who would eventually turn on everyone around him, including the young man he claimed to love like a son. But in 1982, with his father's killers dead and his own star rising, Salvatore Testa could not see the future that was waiting for him. Nicodemo Scarfo's time as boss of the Philadelphia crime family would be remembered as one of the bloodiest in the organization's history. Where Angelo Bruno had led through talking and restraint, where Philip Testa had tried to keep traditional values and loyalty, Scarfo led through fear, paranoia, and uncontrolled violence. Scarfo's way of thinking was simple. Respect was earned by making people afraid. If people were afraid enough of you, they would obey. If they obeyed, you kept your power. And if anyone showed even the smallest sign of disrespect or disloyalty, they had to be killed immediately, not as a last choice, but as the first thing you did. This way of doing things brought in huge amounts of money in the short term. Scarfo put a street tax on all criminal activity in Philadelphia and South Jersey. Anyone running an illegal business, drugs, gambling, prostitution, loan sharking, had to pay a share to the family or face violent consequences. Legal businessmen were threatened and forced to pay for protection. Union officials who did not cooperate were threatened or killed. The family's income went way up, but Scarfo's methods also caused huge problems. His paranoia meant that loyal members were killed over small insults or things he just imagined were plots against him. His violence attracted intense attention from law enforcement. His betrayal of members who had been around for a long time and his breaking of traditional mafia rules created anger and motivated many members to become informants for the government. Some of the killings during Scarfo's reign: Steve Boras, a Greek mobster who ran an independent bookmaking operation. When Boras refused to pay Scarfo's street tax, Scarfo had him killed. This broke traditional rules against killing non-Italian organized crime figures without permission from the commission. Dozens of internal arguments that Bruno would have solved through talking ended with Scarfo ordering murders. An argument over money, a perceived insult, a suspicion of disloyalty. Any of these could get someone killed. The war with the Riccobene group. Harry Riccobene, a captain who had been around before Scarfo took over, refused to accept Scarfo's authority and would not pay the street tax. This led to a nasty internal war, with assassination attempts on both sides and bodies piling up everywhere. Nearly 30 Philadelphia crime family members or associates were killed during Scarfo's reign, more than had died in the previous 20 years under Bruno combined. The streets of South Philadelphia, which had been relatively peaceful during the Pax Bruno, became a war zone. While bodies were dropping in Philadelphia, Atlantic City was growing like never before. By the mid-1980s, almost a dozen major casinos were operating on the boardwalk. Construction projects worth billions of dollars were happening. Tens of thousands of jobs had been created. Atlantic City had been turned from a dying resort town into America's second biggest gambling destination. After Las Vegas, the Philadelphia crime family, with Scarfo based in Atlantic City and controlling the building trade unions, was perfectly positioned to take advantage of this boom. Through their control of unions, especially for bartenders, laborers, and roofers, they could influence which contractors got work, which projects stayed on schedule, and which ones faced labor problems that could cost millions in delays. But Scarfo, continuing the policy that had frustrated the family so much under Bruno, kept letting New York families do business in Atlantic City. The Gambinos, Genovese, and others all had crews working in the casinos, running various schemes, taking their cuts. Scarfo said he did this because he needed support from New York to keep his position, especially with all the opposition he faced inside his own family. But many Philadelphia members resented seeing what they thought was their territory being shared with outsiders. The irony was bitter. They had killed Angelo Bruno partly because he was too willing to share Atlantic City with New York. And now, under Scarfo, New York was more involved than ever. But the money was good. Scarfo himself became rich. His captains did well. And among those who did the best was Salvatore Testa. By 1983 and 1984, Salvatore Testa had become one of the most powerful and wealthy young mobsters in America. At just 27 years old, he controlled his own crew, ran profitable businesses, and had Scarfo's complete trust. Some people started calling him the Crown Prince of the Philadelphia mob, the person who would likely take over and lead the family himself one day. Salvatore's legal wealth had grown a lot. His father had left him an $800,000 estate, which included a rundown bar in Atlantic City. In 1984, Donald Trump, who was building Trump Plaza Casino, wanted the spot where Salvatore's bar was located. Trump paid Salvatore $11 million for the property, more than twice what it was worth, because Trump needed the land quickly, and Salvatore was in a position to hold out for a top price. Combined with his illegal earnings, Salvatore was a millionaire. He had a place to live at the Jersey Shore, near Atlantic City. He kept a boat in Ventnor, New Jersey. He wore expensive clothes, drove nice cars, and enjoyed all the privileges that came with being young, wealthy, and powerful. He was also getting a reputation as an effective, ruthless killer. After getting revenge for his father's death, Salvatore had kept on killing for Scarfo. He carried out murders efficiently and without hesitating. Other mobsters were afraid of him, which in the mafia world meant respect. He had all the qualities needed for leadership: intelligence, courage, ruthlessness, and a willingness to keep discipline through violence. But Salvatore also had a weakness, one he did not fully understand. He had been shaped by his father's death, traumatized by it in ways he could not process or express. He had turned that trauma into violence, finding in killing a release for emotions that had nowhere else to go. This made him effective, but it also made him psychologically vulnerable. He needed Scarfo's approval, needed the validation that came from being the boss's favorite, needed the purpose that came from carrying out Scarfo's orders. He had become attached to Scarfo in a way that made him blind to what Scarfo really was. And Scarfo, for his part, did seem to genuinely care about Salvatore. He treated him almost like a son. He praised him in public. He gave him important responsibilities. He had stood as his godparent for several years. Their relationship seemed solid, built on mutual respect and affection. But Nicodemo Scarfo's paranoia was a disease that got worse over time. It grew worse with the years, fed by cocaine use and by the constant stress of keeping power through terror. And eventually, inevitably, that paranoia would turn toward even the people closest to him. The first signs of trouble appeared in 1984. Salvatore Testa had been engaged to Maria Merlino, the daughter of underboss Chucky Merlino. It should have been a perfect match. The boss's protege marrying the underboss's daughter, cementing alliances and creating family bonds that would make the organization stronger. But Salvatore broke off the engagement. The reasons are still not clear. Maybe he just did not love her. Maybe there were personal problems between them. Maybe he had met someone else in the world of legal relationships. Breaking an engagement is unfortunate, but not a disaster. People change their minds. Relationships end, life goes on. But in the mafia world, where every relationship has political meaning, where family bonds are also organizational bonds, where personal insults turn into disrespect for the organization, breaking an engagement to the underboss's daughter was a serious problem. Chucky Merlino was insulted, his family was insulted, and they let people know how they felt. Around the same time, the Wall Street Journal published a front-page article about Salvatore Testa. The article, published in April 1984, called him the fastest rising star in Scarfo's organization. It told all about his wealth, his operations, his quick rise through the ranks. It showed him as intelligent, capable, and ambitious, the face of a new generation of organized crime. For most people, being featured in the Wall Street Journal would be an honor, a recognition of achievement and importance. For a mobster, it was a disaster. The article brought unwanted attention from law enforcement. It made Salvatore more visible in ways that made him vulnerable. And most dangerously, it set off Nicodemo Scarfo's paranoia. Scarfo started to see Salvatore differently. Instead of a loyal protege, he saw a possible rival. Instead of a capable young leader, he saw someone who might be getting too powerful, too independent, too confident. The newspaper article suggested that Salvatore was building his own power base, creating his own reputation separate from Scarfo's shadow. In Scarfo's paranoid mind, this raised a terrifying possibility. What if Salvatore decided that he should be the boss instead? Rumors started to spread, maybe started by Scarfo's allies, or maybe just coming naturally from the gossip and politics that filled the organization. Salvatore was using drugs. Salvatore was planning to take over. Salvatore was being disrespectful. Salvatore could not be trusted. None of these rumors seemed to have been true. But in an organization led by a paranoid, cocaine-using boss, the truth mattered less than what people believed. Scarfo believed the rumors, or he chose to believe them, or he decided that, regardless of the truth, Salvatore had become too dangerous to let live. By September 1984, Nicodemo Scarfo had made his decision. Salvatore Testa, the son of his murdered friend Philip, the young man he had sworn to protect and guide, the godson whose induction he had personally sponsored, had to die September 1984. The funeral of Joey Pungitore's aunt was held at the Kugler Funeral Home on Broad Street in South Philadelphia. Funerals were important events in the Italian-American community, times for family and friends to get together, to pay their respects, to follow the old rituals of mourning that connected them to their ancestors. Salvatore Testa went to the funeral. Joey Pungitore was his best friend, and paying respects was both a social duty and a real way to show he was sorry for their loss. Salvatore wore a dark suit, stood with the other people who were mourning, and offered his condolences to the family. It was a sad occasion, but also routine, one of countless such events that happened in the lives of people in this close community. After the funeral service was over, people started to file out of the funeral home, gathering on the sidewalk, saying their goodbyes. Salvatore stood among them, shaking hands, exchanging a few quiet words with people he knew. Then Chucky Merlino walked up to him, Merlino, the underboss, the man whose daughter Salvatore had rejected, the second most powerful man in the organization. The two men faced each other, and then, as other mobsters watched, Merlino leaned in and kissed Salvatore on the lips. It was not a quick, simple kiss. Merlino held the kiss for 10 seconds. An eternity in that frozen moment on the funeral home steps. Other mobsters standing nearby were stunned. They understood immediately what they were seeing. In Mafia tradition, the kiss of death is a signal, a mark put on someone who has been condemned to die. It comes from the Bible story of Judas kissing Jesus to identify him to the Roman soldiers. In the Mafia world, it meant, this man is marked for death. Salvatore himself was stunned. As Merlino pulled away and walked off, Salvatore stood frozen, trying to understand what had just happened. Did it really mean what he thought it meant? Had Merlino just signaled in public that Salvatore was condemned? Or was it something else? A strange gesture, an insult, something that could be explained by anger over the broken engagement. Other mobsters who had seen the kiss turned away, unable to look Salvatore in the eyes. One later said, "This guy's nuts." Sal's gotta know now. The meaning was clear to everyone there. Everyone except maybe Salvatore himself, who may have been unable to fully accept that the organization he had served, that his father had served, that he had killed for, was now going to kill him. September 14th, 1984. 2 weeks after the funeral, 2 weeks after the kiss of death, Salvatore Testa should have been in hiding. He should have been armed and alert. He should have been getting ready for the worst. But he was not. Maybe he could not believe it. Maybe he trusted the wrong people. Maybe he just could not imagine that his best friend would betray him. Joey Pungitore called Salvatore and asked him to come to a candy store on East Passyunk Avenue in South Philadelphia. The store was called Too Sweet, a neighborhood place where mobsters sometimes met. Pungitore told Salvatore they needed to talk. that there was business to discuss, that everything would be explained. Salvatore went. He walked into the store, maybe looking for Pungitor, maybe looking around at the familiar surroundings. He was led toward the back room, a private space away from customers and public view. In that back room, Salvatore Wayne Grande was waiting. Grande was a soldier, an enforcer, a man who took orders and carried them out without question. As Salvatore came into the room, maybe starting to realize it was a trap, maybe reaching for a weapon, maybe trying to back toward the door, Grande raised a pistol and fired 2 shots into his head. Salvatore Testa, age 28, dropped to the floor. The crown prince of the Philadelphia mob was dead, murdered by his own organization, betrayed by his best friend, killed on the orders of the man who had claimed to love him like a son. His body was taken from the candy store and driven to New Jersey. The killers dumped him at a roadside in Gloucester Township, leaving him for someone to find. There was no attempt to hide the body, no effort to make it look like an accident. This was a killing meant to send a message. The body was left where it would be found quickly, where the news would spread, where everyone in the organization would learn what happened to those who got too powerful, too independent, too threatening to Scarfo's paranoid rule. September 20th, 1984, St. Paul's Catholic Church in South Philadelphia held the funeral for Salvatore Testa. 300 people came, family, friends, mobsters, neighbors who had watched Salvatore grow up. The church was packed, the mood sad and tense. Philip Testa's widow, Alfia, sat in the front pew, mourning the loss of her son. Just 3.5 years earlier, she had buried her husband, killed by a bomb on their front porch. Now she was burying her son, killed by the very organization his father had given his life to. The double tragedy was almost impossible to understand. One woman had lost both her husband and her son to the mob's violence, both killed by people who were supposed to be friends and allies, both betrayed by the world they thought they could trust. Many of the people at the funeral were members of Scarfo's organization, men who knew that Scarfo had ordered the killing, men who understood that Salvatore's murder was both a warning and a test of loyalty. They came to pay their respects, but also to be seen, to show that they accepted Scarfo's decision, that they would not question or challenge the boss's actions. Among the mourners were the men who had killed Salvatore. Joey Pungutor, the best friend who had tricked him into coming to his death, stood in the church and grieved, or at least acted like he was grieving. The mob required this macabre theater, this pretending to have respect, even as the murderers stood among the people who were mourning. After the church service, Salvatore's body was taken to Holy Cross Cemetery in Yeadon, Pennsylvania, a suburb west of Philadelphia. There he was buried next to his father, Philip. Father and son together again in death, both killed by the organization they had served. The gravestone shows their names, their dates of birth and death, but it cannot show the waste, the tragedy, the pointless destruction of 2 lives in service to a criminal empire that valued them only until they became inconvenient. The murder of Salvatore Testa was a turning point for Nicodemo Scarfo's organization inside the Philadelphia family. Many members were horrified. Salvatore had been respected, capable, loyal. He had avenged his father's murder. He had followed orders without question. If someone like Salvatore could be killed, then no one was safe. The paranoia that had driven Scarfo to kill Salvatore now infected the whole organization. More importantly, the New York families lost faith in Scarfo. The commission had supported Scarfo partly because he seemed able to keep order, but the murder of Salvatore, a high-profile, well-connected, capable young captain, for no clear reason, suggested that Scarfo was out of control. His paranoia and violence were making the Philadelphia family unstable, and instability in one family could spread to others. Pressure from law enforcement was also getting stronger. The RICO prosecutions that had started with Operation Gangplank were growing. The FBI had informants all through the organization. Wiretaps caught conversations that proved they were guilty. The trail of bodies, Bruno, Testa, Narducci, Marinucci, Salvatore Testa, and dozens of others, gave prosecutors a clear pattern of racketeering and murder. And very importantly, members of Scarfo's organization started to cooperate with law enforcement. The breaking point for many was Salvatore Testa's murder. Nicholas Caramandi, a soldier, became a government witness. Phil Lanetti, Scarfo's own nephew and underboss, eventually turned to Tommy Del Giorno, a captain, also became an informant. All of them said that Salvatore's murder was the moment they changed. The moment when they realized that loyalty meant nothing, that the organization would kill anyone, that their own survival depended on getting out or helping the government. Their testimony would be devastating. They gave prosecutors inside details of murders, extortion schemes, criminal operations. They explained how the organization was structured, identified the key players, described how orders came down from Scarfo through the ranks. They turned a RICO case that might have been hard to prove into an overwhelming prosecution, with insider witnesses who could testify about every detail. In 1987, Nicodemo Scarfo was found guilty of multiple murders, including conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, and extortion. The trial was a perfect example of the government's new way of prosecuting organized crime. RICO laws let prosecutors charge the whole organization as a criminal business. Cooperating witnesses gave insider testimony. Wiretaps and surveillance gave evidence to back it up. The case was overwhelming. Scarfo was sentenced to life in prison. He would spend the rest of his life in federal custody, most of it in isolation, to stop him from running the organization from his cell. His conviction was followed by a series of more trials through the late 1980s and early 1990s, each one bringing more convictions, more cooperating witnesses, more devastating revelations about how the organization operated. The Philadelphia crime family was destroyed. Dozens of members were convicted and sent to prison. The leadership structure was completely broken. The younger members, seeing what was happening, either helped the government or stayed away from the organization. The unions that had been controlled for decades were put under federal supervision. The profitable Atlantic City operations were broken up by law enforcement task forces. By the early 1990s, the Philadelphia crime family, once a powerful organization that controlled a major American city, was just a shadow of what it used to be. It still existed, technically, with new bosses claiming leadership and trying to keep things going, but it would never get back the power and influence it had during the Bruno era. The violence and paranoia of the Scarfo years, combined with aggressive federal prosecution, had broken the organization beyond repair. Phil Lanetti, after years in prison, became a government witness and testified against his uncle. His testimony gave some of the most damaging inside information about Scarfo's reign of terror. Lanetti later went into witness protection and disappeared into a new life with a new identity. His life in the mob permanently behind him. The story of the Philadelphia mob became a warning, studied by law enforcement and criminologists. It showed how quickly a powerful criminal organization could fall apart when faced with RICO prosecution, aggressive law enforcement, and betrayal from inside. It showed how paranoid leadership could destroy an organization from the inside. And it showed the human cost of organized crime. not just to the victims of extortion and violence, but to the criminals themselves, who lived lives of constant fear, betrayal, and in the end, self-destruction. The story of Philip Testa and the Philadelphia mob war captured the American imagination in a way that few organized crime stories do. Maybe it was the dramatic violence, a boss killed by a nail bomb on his own doorstep. Maybe it was the tragic story of Salvatore Testa, the son who avenged his father only to be killed by his own organization. Maybe it was just the huge amount of death, with dozens of people killed in a war that ate itself. Bruce Springsteen, watching the news coverage of Philip Testa's murder in March 1981, was inspired to write Atlantic City, one of his most haunting songs. The song appeared on his 1982 album, Nebraska, a stark, acoustic album that explored themes of economic decline, violence, and American desperation in the early Reagan years. The opening line became famous. "Well, they blew up the chicken man in Philly last night. Now they blew up his house." 2. Springsteen's song used Testa's murder as a symbol for the collapse of the American dream, for the violence and desperation that hid underneath the surface of respectable society. The song's narrator is a man driven by economic hardship to think about a life of crime, heading to Atlantic City for one last chance, knowing that everything is falling apart. Nebraska is considered one of Springsteen's masterpieces, and Atlantic City is one of its most powerful tracks. Every time the song is played, and it has been performed thousands of times in concert, covered by dozens of artists, analyzed in countless music reviews. Philip Testa's name is brought up, his death remembered. The chicken man became a symbol, his violent death turned into art. In 2024, a biographical film about Springsteen called Deliver Me From Nowhere was released, focusing on the making of the Nebraska album. The film explored how Springsteen was influenced by the newspaper coverage of Testa's murder and the Philadelphia mob war, how those real events shaped the bleak, violent world of his songs. Philip Testa's murder, filtered through Springsteen's artistic vision, became part of American cultural history. Documentary series and true crime shows have revisited the Philadelphia mob war many times. A Netflix documentary, Mob War, Philadelphia vs. the Mafia, looked at the conflict in detail, interviewing surviving participants, law enforcement officials, and family members. The story has appeared in books, podcasts, and academic studies of organized crime today. If you visit 2117 Porter Street in South Philadelphia, you will find a rebuilt home. The structure that was damaged by the bomb has been fixed. Different families have lived there over the decades since 1981. Life has gone on. Children play in Stephen Gerrard Park across the street. Neighbors come and go. The block looks like thousands of others in South Philadelphia. Working class, neat, ordinary, but people who remember that March night in 1981 still talk about it. Older residents remember the explosion, the smoke, the blood on the sidewalk. They remember Philip Testa, who they might have known as a neighbor, a figure in the community. They remember the fear that took over the neighborhood afterward, the police presence, the feeling that violence had come to their quiet street. The house itself has no marker, no historical plaque. Nothing says it was the site of a murder that would start a mob war. That would inspire one of Bruce Springsteen's most famous songs. That would eventually help destroy one of America's most powerful crime families. It is just a house on a street in South Philadelphia, looking just like its neighbors, its violent past erased by time and rebuilding. But the memory lives on in the stories passed down in the neighborhood, in the occasional true crime tourist who who drives by hoping to see where the chicken man died. The history lives on. The violence that destroyed Philip Testa and his son, that killed dozens of mobsters, that destroyed families and shattered lives, is remembered. Philip the Chicken Man, Testa ruled the Philadelphia crime family for exactly 365 days. 1 year, 56 years of life, decades of criminal activity, a lifetime of violence and loyalty. All of it led to 12 months of absolute power, followed by 3 seconds of horrific death. But his legacy went far beyond those 365 days. His murder started a series of events that would destroy the organization he and Angelo Bruno had spent decades building. The decision to make Nicodemo Scarfo the boss, a decision made by the commission, not by Testa, would prove to be a disaster. Scarfo's paranoid, violent reign would kill dozens, drive members to become government informants, and eventually bring the whole organization down. Testa's greatest tragedy, maybe, was bringing his own son into the life. In June 1980, when Salvatore said the oath, when he pricked his finger and burned the saint's card, when he swore to put the family above everything else, Philip Testa must have felt proud. He was passing on a legacy, bringing his son into the world he knew, making sure Salvatore had a future in the organization. But that decision doomed Salvatore, the mob that Philip believed in, the one bound by codes of honor and loyalty, where made men were brothers, where the organization protected its own, no longer existed, if it ever really had. The new generation, shaped by drugs and money and individualism, did not share those values, and Salvatore, traumatized by his father's murder, turning his grief into violence, looking for approval from a paranoid psychopath, never had a chance. Father and son buried next to each other in Holy Cross Cemetery, both killed by their own organization, both betrayed by men they trusted, both destroyed by the world they thought they controlled. The Philadelphia mob war of 1980 to 1984 was a turning point in American organized crime. It showed several realities that would change the mafia landscape forever. The RICO law worked. Federal prosecutors, using this fairly new tool, could take apart entire organizations by proving patterns of racketeering. Individual crimes could be tied together into complete cases that led to huge prison sentences. Omerta was breaking down. The code of silence, once thought to be absolute, was crumbling. When organizations became unstable and violent, when loyalty was not returned, when members realized they would be killed no matter how faithful they were, they made the rational choice to cooperate with the government. Each cooperating witness made the next one more acceptable. The shame of becoming an informant faded as the practice became more common. Paranoid leadership destroyed organizations from the inside. Scarfo's reign showed that you could not rule just through fear and violence. Eventually, the fear turned inward. The violence consumed the organization itself, and the whole structure fell apart. Strong organizations needed some level of trust and shared interest. Pure terror could not last. The commission's power was fading. The fact that 2 bosses had been killed without permission, that the commission's responses, killing Capo Negro but exiling Casella, were not consistent, that they had chosen Scarfo even though he was clearly unstable. All of this suggested that the commission's authority was not what it used to be. The national structure of the mafia was breaking apart. Drug dealing was unavoidable. Bruno's ban on drugs had been well-intentioned, but in the end, it was impossible to keep up. The profits were too big, the temptation too strong. Every family, including Philadelphia, eventually got involved in drugs, even when they were officially banned. And drugs brought both huge wealth and terrible consequences. Addiction among members, government attention, the breakdown of organizational discipline. The Philadelphia mob war was not unique. Similar conflicts happened in other cities during the 1980s and 1990s, but it was especially dramatic, especially well documented, and especially destructive. It was a template that law enforcement would study and that other families would learn from. Usually too late to save themselves. What can we learn from the story of Philip Testa? What does his life and death tell us about organized crime, about loyalty and betrayal, about the cost of a criminal life? First, that the codes and traditions that supposedly ruled the mafia were always more fiction than reality. Philip Testa believed in loyalty. He believed that if you followed the rules, respected the hierarchy, and served the organization, you would be protected and respected in return. Angela Bruno had believed the same thing. Both men were murdered by their own organizations, killed by men who had taken oaths of loyalty and then broken them the moment it helped their own interests. The reality was that the mafia was never a brotherhood or a family in any real way. It was a criminal business held together by mutual self-interest and the threat of violence. When self-interest suggested betrayal, loyalty disappeared. When violence could help someone get ahead, oaths became meaningless. The talk of honor and respect was a useful lie for keeping discipline, but it had no real power when tested against ambition and greed. Second, that violence as a way to run an organization eventually fails. Angelo Bruno understood this. His long, peaceful reign brought stability and wealth. Philip Testa tried to follow Bruno's example, but he did not have Bruno's skill at dealing with people. Scarfo used violence as his main way of keeping control, and it destroyed his organization within a few years. You cannot build anything that lasts on fear alone. Eventually, the fear turns into paranoia, the violence turns inward, and the organization eats itself. Third, that bringing family members into criminal organizations is a form of child abuse. Philip Testa loved his son. There is no doubt about that. But by making Salvatore a part of the mob, Philip doomed him to a life that could only end in prison or death. Salvatore never had a real chance to choose a different path. He was raised in that culture, shaped by it, pulled into it by his father's example and expectations. And when he needed protection from the organization's violence, when he needed the loyalty and respect that had been promised, it was not there. He died at 28, murdered by men who had sworn to protect him, betrayed by his best friend, killed on the orders of his godfather. This pattern happened again and again in the mafia world. Sons brought into the life by their fathers, often dying young, leaving behind grieving parents who could not see, or would not admit, that they were responsible for their children's fates. The mafia's glorification of family was always deeply dishonest. It destroyed families, even as it claimed to honor them. Fourth, that crime does not pay, not in the long run, not when you count up all the costs. Yes, Philip Testa had money and power. Yes, he lived better than he might have if he had worked a legal job, but he spent his life in constant danger, surrounded by people who would kill him for their own advantage. Unable to trust anyone completely, he watched his best friend get murdered. He ran his organization for 1 year before being blown apart by a nail bomb on his own doorstep. And his son, who might have escaped that life, was pulled into it and destroyed. What did Philip Testa really gain? What was it all for? In the end, he left behind a widow who lost both her husband and her son to mob violence, a daughter who watched her family destroyed, a legacy written in blood on a South Philadelphia street, If there is a profit and loss statement for a criminal life, Philip Testa's ledger shows a devastating loss. Finally, that individual people matter, but systems continue. Philip Testa was a complicated man, violent but loyal, a criminal but religious, ruthless but devoted to his family. His story is uniquely tragic, but the system that created him, that shaped him, that eventually killed him and his son, that system continues. The Philadelphia crime family still exists in a much smaller form. Organized crime still operates in Philadelphia and all across America. Young men still make the choice to enter that world, still believe they can succeed where others have failed, still think they can find their way through the dangers and come out ahead. The story of Philip Testa should be a warning. It should show the pointlessness and tragedy of the criminal life. But warnings only work if people listen to them. And every generation creates young men who believe they are different, who think they are smarter, who convince themselves that they can beat the odds. They cannot. The game is fixed. The house always wins. And the house in this case is not the mafia, but the basic math of the criminal life, that betrayal is more profitable than loyalty, that violence creates more violence, that criminal organizations will inevitably destroy themselves and everyone in them. March 15th, 1981, a nail bomb explodes on Porter Street. A man dies before he even knows what is happening, and the ripples from that explosion spread outward, killing dozens more, destroying an organization, leaving families shattered and communities traumatized, inspiring songs and documentaries and cautionary tales that continue decades later. Philip, the Chicken Man. Testa was not a good man. He was a criminal who ordered murders, who forced legal businessmen to pay him, who took part in corruption and violence. He does not deserve sympathy for the choices he made or the things he did, but he does deserve to be remembered accurately, not as a cartoon villain, but as a complicated human being who made terrible choices and paid a terrible price. His story is America's story, seen in a dark and distorted mirror. The immigrant dream twisted into criminal business. Loyalty and family twisted into excuses for violence. The search for respect and security leading only to paranoia and death. The codes and traditions meant to create order becoming tools of chaos. The sons following their fathers into destruction today. 2117 Porter Street stands quiet in South Philadelphia. The explosion that shook the neighborhood that March night has faded into memory and history. The blood has long since been washed away. Life goes on, but the lessons remain for those willing to learn them. Philip Testa lived by violence. He died by violence. And the violence did not end with him. That is the real legacy of the Chicken Man. Not 1 year of power, not wealth or respect, not the organization he tried to lead. His legacy is the proof, written in his own blood and his son's, that the criminal life leads nowhere but down, that loyalty in that world is an illusion, that the codes of honor are lies, that the family will kill its own, that no one escapes. The Chicken Man thought he knew the rules. He thought if he followed them, if he served loyally, if he respected the traditions, he would be protected. He was wrong. The only real rule in the mafia world is the oldest rule of all: survival of the most ruthless, the most paranoid, the most willing to betray. And even they, in the end, fall. That is the complete story of Philip, the Chicken Man, Testa, a story of loyalty and betrayal, of fathers and sons, of violence and consequences, of one man's year of power and the decades of destruction that followed. It is a story without heroes, without winners, without redemption. It is a tragedy, pure and brutal, that echoes from the past as a warning to the future. A warning that, like all warnings, will probably not be heeded, because every generation creates its own Philip Testis, its own Salvatore Testis. Men who believe they can move through the darkness without being consumed by it. And every generation learns, too late, that they cannot. And that brings us to the end of this journey, through one of the darkest chapters in American organized crime history. If you made it this far, I really appreciate you spending these hours with me. The story of Philip Testa and his son Salvatore is one of tragedy, betrayal, and the terrible results of a life lived outside the law. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What part of this story struck you the most? Did you know about the Chicken Man before this video? Are there other mob figures you would like me to cover in future deep dives? If you enjoyed this documentary-style storytelling, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Ring the notification bell so you never miss when I upload these long, thoroughly researched true crime stories. Share this video with anyone interested in real American history, the stories they do not teach in school. Thank you for watching. Take care of yourselves, and remember, every choice has consequences. Philip Testa learned it the hardest way possible. Until next time, sleep well.